are ready to begin. This is the third event in the series of 4. So if you're going to be around in 2 more weeks, don't forget the last one. That one's going to be a lot of fun too. Matt Simino is going to give his all the little tidbits about the West End history and lore, and so it should be a lot of fun. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 13th annual summer series of the Tony Woiak History Festival, and remind you that this is brought to you by the Washburn Area Historical Society as well as the Washburn Heritage Association. We work together on this one. And I want to thank all the volunteers that make these happen. There's a lot of work that goes into every step. I'd like to thank the Harbor Table. They do all the setup for us and they do a really good job. They provide the place. And then I'd also like to thank you, the audience, because you keep coming back. So I appreciate that, and it makes it fun. The audience really, we get great speakers, but really it's the audience that makes the show. So really, I believe that, I watch that. So thank you for keeping your attendance up. And I want to thank the presenters as well, of course. I'm reminding everyone of the sort of new situation we got after the, we may have time for a few questions from the audience, and then it looks like we're ready to wrap up a little bit, and you have more you'd like to say to our presenter or stories you'd like to tell. We're going to ask the presenter just to move to the back of the room. Otherwise, we've got people coming forward, and there are a lot of things that can get knocked over and tripped over up here. So she will be moving to the back at some point, so don't worry, you'll have a chance to talk to her. We have been looking forward to this evening's presentation for a long time. Julia Prohaska is one of countless Ungrodt family members who return to Washburn every summer. And Julia's curiosity about her family's stories and her love for Washburn have been the driving force for the research she's done to prepare for tonight. We are grateful to her and her family for jumping into this program with such enthusiasm. And let's welcome Julia.
Thank you very, very much. I have to confess, I've given a lot of presentations in my life. This is the first time I've presented with a lot of family in the audience, and also about something that I love so dearly. So at some point, I'm likely to dissolve into a pile of tears, and someone should just hook me off the stage at that point. But thank you for coming tonight. My name is Julia Prohaska, and as the poster promised, I'm here tonight to talk about the Ungrodt family and businesses, and I did bring bridge mix. It's scattered about the room, and it started out as about 5 pounds when I got up here 3 days ago, but then the family arrived, so now there's about 3 pounds out there. But before I begin, I'd like to thank Jenny Peterson and the Kiosk Committee for the Washburn Heritage Association, because they're the ones who reached out with an invitation to share the Ungrodts story. And when I agreed to share our history and photos, I really had little idea how much fun it would be to prepare for this. Over the last couple of months, I found answers to questions we wondered about for decades and retraced steps of my great-grandfather and great-grandmother all around Washburn. And in the process, met so many good people, including Susan McGrath at the Washington Historical Museum, and Dan and Steve at the Register of Deeds, who taught me how to unlock the mysterious code of gigantic books and historical records with 130-year-old handwriting in it, so it was a lot of fun. I have a silent partner in tonight's presentation, and that's my husband, David, who's going to be running the presentation. And it turns out he could find solid footing as a forensic detective. He tracked down the daughter of Washburn historian Lars Larson, and she not only confirmed an important date for us, but also took the opportunity to share that her father was an employee of Ungrodt Hardware and kept until his death last November a gift that was given to him by the family many years ago as a graduation gift. David also mined the depths of newspaperclippings.com and helped me cross-reference public records with family journals. and he now knows more about my family than I do. And that's something I don't generally recommend. But since we've been married for 35 years, he already knew what he'd gotten himself into. He did tell me today he was making one last trip to the courthouse for something, and I asked him, "Are you starting divorce proceedings?" Together, we also had the good fortune to spend a morning over coffee with the Olsons at their kitchen counter, where Dick and Sandy contributed photos and anecdotes and shared memories and laughs. As a prior speaker for the Tony Woiak series, it's Dick who reassured me that while I shouldn't outright lie, a little embellishment tonight wouldn't hurt anyone. Finally, a big thank you to the extended Ungrodt family yesterday and today, but particularly those in attendance tonight who allowed me to represent our story. We don't all share a name anymore, but we share a love for Washburn, its history, the lake, and generally speaking, for each other. Generally speaking. We come back every summer. There are about a dozen of us here tonight, and another 15 will arrive this weekend for our annual reunion. By the way, we have one bathroom. Also with us tonight is my mom, Jane. Go like this, Jane. Who, at 84, is our oldest living descendant of Ben and Lena Ungrodt, and the last to remember Lena. She didn't want me to tell her age. So I have the microphone. So, let's go. The story of our family in Washburn begins with Ben Ungrodt, born in 1863 in South Africa, the son of German Rhenish missionaries Bernhard Ungrodt and Johanna Schroeder. In 1867, the family moved from South Africa to southern Wisconsin, like you do, and eventually to Medford, where the preacher led a congregation for several decades. Lore has it that their third son, 23-year-old Ben, arrived in Washburn in 1886 with $500 in his pocket. Together with his brother-in-law, Paul Schultz, he opened a general merchandise and hardware store in the center of a booming lumber business in this fast-growing lakeside town. The first store was on Bayfield Street, on the location of the current Washburn Ranger District building. It offered general merchandise, household goods, heavy hardware, building supplies, and dynamite. That comes up again later. For the first year, Ben had a business partner in Ernst Bergman, who eventually opened his own hardware enterprise down the street. In this picture of Ben and Paul's store, we see Mrs. Bergman in the second-story window. Now, we've heard the stories of second-floor brothels in Washburn, but great Aunt Irene assured us this is Mrs. Bergman, so that's our story, and we're sticking to it. By the way, I'll mention numerous family names tonight, and if you are a descendant of any of these folks, we'd love to meet you at the end of the night and share memories. Unless our family owes you money, then we can just skip that part. While Ben was establishing his business in Washburn, Helene Helmer, the daughter of an actor and stage seamstress, had come of age in the city of St. Louis. Lena, as she was called, visited family friends in Medford, Wisconsin, where she met young Ben through mutual friends. Ben and Lena were married in 1891 and settled in Washburn. It's hard to know what a day in the life was like for Lena. It was a custom of the times for press to focus on business and the men who ran them. In our search for the name Ungrodt in press archives, Ben was mentioned by name 812 times, with only 21 mentions of Mrs. B. Ungrodt. Only one mentioned her by name, and that was her obituary. She kept no journal, but I've always wondered what this young city woman thought when she first arrived in northern Wisconsin with our long, hard winters to a town filled with lumbermen. In a memoir written by her son, Paul, many years later, he described life in early Washburn as rugged. The streets a sea of mud after the slightest rain, and sidewalks made of planks. There were no electric lights, sewer, or water. Ben and Lena started their family, and in 1896, purchased a home at the corner of 5th and Washington. The house had been built by George Fox, who served as the town's jeweler and, get this, druggist. Fox advertisements from 1899 promised diamonds, gold, and silver gifts, along with cures for the common cold. This seems very efficient to me. me. The house, which still stands today, is an example of a Queen Anne Victorian popular in the late 1800s, with a brownstone foundation and cross-gabled roof and tower. The property had a city barn that housed the family's horse and carriage. Over the next 12 years, Ben and Lena had 6 children: Edna, Carl, Paul, Hugo, my grandfather Herbert, also known as Hub, and Irene. A baby girl, Marguerite, was born but died shortly after her first birthday. Her original oil portrait hangs on the 2nd floor of the Washburn Museum. Today, all 68 of us who regularly return to Washburn or live here trace our roots back to one of these 6 Ungrots. Between 1886 and 1937, the Ungrodt hardware business called at least 4 locations home. The first, as mentioned, was on the location of the current Washburn Ranger District building. Ben and Paul Schultz paid $1,000 for the building. In 1893, they moved south on Bayfield Street to the current location of the North Coast Motel. In 1907, they moved across the street to the present location of Bremer Bank. And 9 years later, they bought 3 outlets from the Olsons. And in 1937, the business landed in the current location of Washburn Hardware in the Meehan Block. A dozen of Ben's handwritten store ledgers, including his first from March 25th, 1886, are still in the family and show customer names like Tetzner, DuPont, and A.A. Bigelow, with entries like 1 dozen saws, 1 dozen axe heads, and 1 dozen axe handles for $7.50. In addition to large equipment and general hardware, significant business was done in kitchen ranges and heating stoves, with brands like Monarch and Round Oak. The cast iron stoves lined both walls of the shop, and for years a separate building was kept just to accommodate those. Weighing 300 to 600 pounds, these beasts were regularly delivered by horse-drawn wagon and dragged to second-floor spaces by store employees and family. Hardware store hours ran from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Merchandise was stacked to the ceilings with rolling ladders on tracks. 2 deliveries a day were made to the lumber mills. The 6 Ungrodt children helped in the store and drove the delivery wagon to each of the mill docks. From the start, Ben was a clever marketer, consistently using advertisements in the Washburn News and later the Washburn Times. This ad explains in detail why the paints carried at the hardware were of such high quality, providing universal satisfaction. The answer? High quality linseed oil and lead. This ad captures the bold spirit of the early pioneers, suggesting that when planting fruit trees, you should do away with the traditional shovel for digging a hole in favor of, wait for it, dynamite. The ad explains the benefits of this violent method, which makes room for fast root expansion, producing hardier and more colorful fruits in just 2 years. If you live. That the average person might purchase, plant, and light a stick of dynamite in order to plant a fruit tree is, to me, evidence that our forefathers were of hardier stock. From the earliest years in business, Ben carried and marketed some products as gifts. Initially basics like silverware, coffee pots, cooking pans, and stoves, but eventually items considered luxury like Bissell carpet sweepers and Pyrex ware. Flexible flyer sleds, ice skates, skis, and flashlights were pitched as the perfect Christmas gift for a sister or brother. Clippings on the life of Ben in the hardware store also give us a glimpse into the crime scene in early Washburn. Here it's reported that a group of boys had been, quote, shooting the locks off the dynamite house behind the store in which is stored high explosives. The hardware store was also robbed twice, thieves taking money, guns, and other merchandise. And yet another article elaborated at length about a group of boys, or quote, rascals, as they were called, who had stolen most of the plums from the trees in Ben's property. Ben was an accomplished gardener and had planned to enter ripened plums in the Bayfield County Fair later that year. The article warned that if the culprits weren't found and dealt with harshly, they could be on a path to a life of hard crime. Weeks later, the same paper reported that Lena took the blue ribbon for her canned plums at said fair. Way to save the day, Grandma. While the lumber business started to soften, the first 2 decades of the new century were prosperous for Ben and Lena. They purchased no fewer than 18 additional lots in and around Washburn, not including storage and warehouses. Many years later, their son Paul wrote in a memoir that, quote, business boomed in the early years through World War I when DuPont made explosives for Uncle Sam. Stoves, nails, and carpentry tools for workers at the DuPont plant were in such great demand they were difficult to keep in supply. This picture shows the robustly stocked shelves and point-of-sale signs that showed that the store was still carrying Griffin knives, but also Victor talking machines. As the business grew, Ben also diversified, opening a second store in Iron River in 1909. It was run by Lena's brother, Max Helmer. Family correspondence makes references to going, quote, out west, referring to trips to Iron River to help in the store there. He also purchased 122 acres near Iron River. Back in Washburn, Ben invested in a brick-making company and the Anchor Shipbuilding Company, where he served on the board of directors. In 1907, with 5 children, the Ungrots added an addition to the house on Washington Avenue. That same year, Ben purchased what was referred to as a yacht named Princess, which he was having fit for the season. We really were surprised to hear this. He was also reported to own one of the first cars in town, a Studebaker. Clearly, business was booming. In 1911, Ben purchased 20 acres near Houghton Falls. This clip documents the purchase, calling it, quote, a nice piece of land. We had never heard this until preparing for this presentation, but upon learning of this just recently, our family has discussed it and decided that we'd really like to have back 20 acres near Houghton Falls. So tonight, we have a very special announcement. We'd like to publicly make an offer to the current owners to purchase it back. Knowing that times have changed, we are prepared to offer 10 times what my great-grandfather paid for it, which was $1. According to the journal writings of Paul and Irene, who served as a teacher here in Washburn for many years, the 6 Ungrodt children had a memorable childhood in Washburn. The family famously loved their animals, with stories through the years of 2 beloved horses, 3 dogs with names Sport, Shep, and Punch, and a pony named Dan. Ben bought Dan for the Ungrodt children and rode with the nervous pony, first in a rail car from Medford to Ashland, and then on the Mary Scott across the bay to Washburn. Dan gave regular rides to the Ungrodt children and friends. He pulled a buckboard buggy and basket carriage for Sunday drives and special occasions, and in the winter, he pulled sleighs and children on their skis. According to Aunt Irene, Ben was up early each morning to care for the horses and took great pride polishing their leather harnesses and on special occasions, brass bells. Irene also noted that my Grandpa Hub was an expert rider of the horse who could otherwise be known as stubborn, occasionally stopping on very short notice. Yet Dan was so beloved by the community that he received an obituary in the Minneapolis and Milwaukee papers. To this day, the Ungrodt families love our pets, with our reunion in 2019 clocking in at 31 people and 9 dogs. The family also camped for weeks at a time at a cabin on Madeline Island. This picture, taken in 1903, shows Lena in a heavy swim dress seated in the bow of a boat on Madeline with the Bayfield shoreline in the background. It marks just one of many excursions we made to the islands over the next 100 years. The Washburn Ungrotts were close to both Ben and Lena's siblings with regular visits between their families. The family loved music, and gatherings often involved playing the organ, with Ben and his siblings singing German folk songs. According to Irene, Ben provided the, quote, lubricant in the form of Rhine wine with pineapple. While the children were expected to help in the store from a young age, they eventually gained significant influence over it. In 1921, while Ben and Lena took a trip to Florida to visit their oldest daughter, Edna, Paul teamed up with brother Carl to dramatically re-merchandise the store, removing shelves from the walls and displaying the product in the center of the store. They also added a display in the front window which mimicked the scene of a trout stream, complete with foliage, mossy banks, running water, and live trout. Sell to sell again, which lasted for years. In 1923, upon completion of college, Paul returned to Washburn and at the urging of the community ran and won the seat as mayor of Washburn. Reportedly, the youngest mayor in the country, he was referred to as boy mayor or kid mayor in local and national press. His primary platform was to relieve Washburn of its crushing debt by collecting overdue taxes from its citizens. Paul recruited another 23-year-old, Nora Montbriand, as treasurer for the town. According to this article, Nora won the seat by a mere one vote by, quote, a mere man. The two took no salaries for themselves during their terms and were widely credited with pulling Washburn out of $22,000 of debt created by fall off after the boom of World War I. The boy mayor also waged a war on gambling and alcohol, removing 20 slot machines from pool halls and endorsing the smashing of the moonshine distilleries. This article applauds his effort to, quote, curb the evil in Washburn. Years later, we find this very ironic given the Ungrotts' well-known love of happy hour. After 2 terms, Paul ran for and won a seat in the Wisconsin State Assembly. His campaign promises included revising education to bring the same opportunities to children in disadvantaged communities as those in wealthier ones. He also promised to support measures in conservation and reforestation, particularly of northern Wisconsin. In this article, he notes that it was his intention to support legislation that benefited the majority of citizens regardless of which party proposed it. I do not discount the value of parties, he said, but I believe that legislation should be unquestionably for the interest of Wisconsin citizens rather than political parties. After his term in the Assembly, Paul moved to Michigan. Back in Washburn, the hardware business began to soften through the 20s and into the Great Depression. This picture of Ben and son Hugo was taken in 1930 and shows Ernst tools in one window and Philco radios in the other. We know little about how the business managed in those hard years, but it's safe to say that it survived in part because Ben had a pretty good head start. Boats and properties were sold, and in 1934, with his health failing, Ben went to convalesce in Florida with daughter Edna, and while there, died at the age of 71. When we found this official obituary, I have to admit I felt a little emotional. I realized that through this search, I'd come to really like this man I never met. I had thought of him only as the son of a stern preacher, but I came to appreciate and admire this man who was referred to by his family as gentle, who loved his family and animals, who traveled with a nervous pony in a freight cart, and who tended a garden and plum trees. While Ben's death marked the end of an era, it began a new chapter for Ungrodt hardware. In 1937, despite sagging sales, Lena and the 6 children made the bold decision to purchase the Meehan complex, undertake significant remodeling, and move the hardware store one last time to its present location. Oldest son Carl ran the store for the next 20 years, staying in Washburn with his family. Also in 1937, Paul opened a Ben Franklin in the space next door to the hardware with an interior door between the 2 stores. The Ben Franklin to this day is remembered as a place to find almost anything you needed, from art and school supplies to fabric, cosmetics, underwear, and toys. And perhaps most memorably, candy. A recent post on the Facebook page, You Know You're From Washburn, had folks reminiscing about the Ben Franklin candy counter with its antique scale that used individual weights to measure your candy. Favorites included rubber bellies, root beer barrels, chocolate stars, bazooka bubble gum, bridge mix, and my personal favorite and the pride of American candy companies, the candy cigarette. It was, after all, the 70s. Under the care of Shirley, Gladys, and Audrey, the candy counter and the Ben Franklin flourished for years while Ruth Carlson worked next door at the hardware store. These women of Washburn were as much the face of the Ungrodt businesses as their owners. As kids, when we came to visit each summer, they always recognized us and seemed to know which branch of the family we were from, a legitimate feat as the family expanded. When Carl died in 1957, Otto Hoppy Geisert, an employee of Ungrodt Hardware for over 50 years, took the helm as store manager with help from Ben's son, Hugo. So let's talk about Hugo. The third son of Ben and Lena and lifelong bachelor, Hugo stayed in Washburn, working in the early years for the railroad company, then DuPont, and eventually assisting Hoppy at the store. The stories of Hugo could fill a presentation on its own. In addition to being a personality in the store, Hugo is best known for walking about town with dog biscuits in one pocket and candy in the other for kids, which today could probably get you in trouble. Nevertheless, he was a character who loved telling the stories of early Washburn and complaining about its traffic. He was friends with Washburn journalist and photographer Chick Sheridan, and on Sunday afternoons could be found enjoying a chilled Manhattan at the home of Billy Radar Anderson and wife Louise. Hugo attracted dogs like the Pied Piper. In addition to his own, Tizzy, Toonie or Tuna Fish, and Wags, we came to know dogs that weren't even his, but followed him around town and came out to the cottage. This is Jessie. We still don't, pardon? No.
As soon as that truck started up, she'd bark and bark, bark, you better come over.
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh, you should take these home with you.
I thought I said the dog was just.
That's fantastic. Well, that does ruin my next line, which is we still don't know who her family was, but for a while she was part of ours. Truly, we loved her. We loved her. That's great. Let's talk afterwards. Hugo had a mumbling and meandering communication style, using some goofy words and turns of a phrase. To this day, our family remembers nicknames given by him. You really haven't lived until you've been called Potato Face. By the way, a couple people mentioned before this started that they had nicknames from him, so at the end of the night, I think we should gather in the back and I'd like to hear everybody's. Hugo loved it when we all came to town, bringing us presents from the Ben Franklin, sponsoring steak night at the cottage, and offering us rides in the hardware pickup and the 1937 Oldsmobile that he referred to as Black Beauty. The car, originally Lena's, was in the family for over 50 years before it was donated to the Washburn Museum as a taxi. This morning, we had a visit at the cottage from Gary Holman, who gave us this incredible gift, a poem that he wrote about Hugo that pretty much sums him up. I hope I do this justice, Gary. When it's Washburn you're talking, it's Hugo out walking, a dog with some biscuits in hand. If the traffic on Washington Avenue was slow, it was led by an old red Ford truck. If it's memorabilia that some days would appeal to you, then a chat with Hugo would do. A legend, a treasure, 'twas always a pleasure. Just Hugo, a hound dog, and you. To the best of our knowledge, the Ungrodts never missed entering a float for the Washburn homecoming parades. Entries through the years included slogans like, "The Old Way," "We helped bring Washburn out from the woods," "Let us help you come home to a modern kitchen," and this one, a family favorite today, as we think it provides insight into the origins of our widespread anxious pessimism. The slogan reads, "Enjoy yourself, it's later than you think." Because who does not want to be reminded of your mortality while sitting on a street curb watching a parade? And it appears that we were offering Maytag as a solution to your existential dilemma. We also celebrated the bicentennial, where my sister Kathleen served as Betsy Ross. Kathleen is here tonight. And beyond that, there was a series of unusual entries that included Brad on water skis with Bob playing tennis on a float, Hugo in a fur coat on a scooter, my mom and aunts Liz and Jan on a bobsled, and a generation of family members playing volleyball on a moving float. What could go wrong? But surely our favorite parade entries came in the 80s and 90s. In 1985, Paul's oldest son, Skip, had first seen the renowned Fred Hill briefcase drill team in Plymouth, Michigan. And in a natural leap of imagination, he decided that briefcases could be swapped out for more hardware-friendly lawnmowers. Now, if you knew Skip, you know that he had a way of saying, this is what we're going to do. And lo and behold, weeks later, you found yourself pushing a lawnmower down Mayfield Street. The first lawnmower drill team were led by Joel. Joel would be Ben's grandson, Hub's son, my mom's brother, Skip's cousin, and Jed's dad. There's going to be a quiz on this at the end. Joel's demeanor was as far from an Army drill sergeant as one could get. He was gentle and introspective. He just wasn't a shouter. And yet when he put a whistle around his neck and called us to attention, we fell in line, generally. So if you happen to drive down Omaha the week before the parade, you might find a ragtag group of people weaving around the road in practice and occasionally crashing into each other. But by the end of the week, with the exception of Bob, who was often on the wrong foot, we were a tight-knit group with some pretty good moves. But we didn't stop there, knowing that all good parades have twirlers. My sisters, Kathleen and Patrice, became the first of what came to be known as the Plungerettes. Now, I don't know the last time you twirled a toilet plunger, but it's embarrassing, and since they both disappeared for 10 minutes right before the parade, we strongly suspect that their dynamic performance was fueled by liquid courage from the firehouse. The original Plungerettes hung up their tennies, but passed their plungers on to me, and then another generation of twirlers who performed in the next two parades. Today, these women are all grown up, and together we consider ourselves a distinguished group of parade veterans. The few, the proud, the Plungerettes. I can't move on from parades, though, without highlighting an Olson building entry in 1986. As this presentation suggests, the Ungrodt family had our share of characters, some of us a little wacky, and clever reference was made to this on the Olson float that read, Ungrotts have the nuts and bolts, but Olsons have the studs. Way to go, Olsons. It's our presentation. You've got the biggest clap. Dick and Sandy gave me this picture recently, and Dick said, we figured when we did it, well, you can take that however you want, to which I replied, oh, we knew exactly how to take it. In the final chapter of Ungrodt Hardware, Hugo retired, and Paul's three sons, Skip, Brad, and Bob, purchased the store from the family in 1984. The pace of the business had slowed considerably from the booming days of its inception, but the three brothers still believed in the tradition of small business, that there should continue to be a local alternative to Walmart. Bob moved to Washburn and ran the store for the next 24 years before the family sold the business and building to Nate and Susie Swiston, who still own it today. While Bob had relatively little knowledge of hardware, he carried on an important tradition and was active in the community, supporting sports teams, fundraisers, and sitting on boards. Rumor has it he may have dozed through a board meeting or two, but was easily awakened in time to vote. Bob was a beloved member of the family and community. At the Ungrodt Hardware retirement party, Gary Holman read a poem with this perfect conclusion. I've known Ungrodt Hardware since age 3 or 4, when riding Grandpa's shoulders we first stopped by the store. With cash from lawn mowing before 1950, bought my first Schwinn from Hugo. I thought it was nifty. I never knew Ben, but we have known most of the rest, the good folks who've worked here and survived all the tests, supplying our needs from appliance to pin. If not on the shelf, then by Thursday it was in. It was also Sandy Olson who said, when we think of your family, we think love of Washburn. And it's from this truth the restoration of the brownstone bank is rooted. The building was listed as one of the 10 oldest in Wisconsin, but was destined for the wrecking ball, to be dismantled with the brownstone sent to New York. As Dick tells it, conversation about the bank's restoration first started at the timeout, where Paul sat over breakfast one morning staring out the window and pondering its fate. When Paul passed away, his son Skip stepped in and gave shape to the idea of what is now the Washburn Museum and Cultural Center. Over the course of the next 2 years, Skip assembled a board of directors with Washburn all-stars like Ted Root, Dick Scamper, Tom Lindsay, Ruth Harnoy, Marion Munson-Jonas, Neil Fry, and of course Dick, who still serves as president of the board. Together, they made plans to restore the building, gathered the museum's initial artifacts, and established an endowment to ensure the building's future. In Skip's words, he wanted to preserve the heritage of the founding families and early citizens of Washburn. On the second floor, you can see various artifacts of the early Ungrodts, including the pony carriage pulled by Faithful Dan, a miniature cast iron stove, which had been a floor model in the store but was taken home to serve as a toy, and the family's original Victrola. I've mentioned throughout the night that many of us still return to Washburn. Sometime in the 1930s, after 4 of Ben and Lena's children had left town, the family started renting properties on the lake for return visits in the summer. They became fond of a property perched on a beautiful point about a mile north of Houghton. The summer home had been built in 1910 and was owned by E.P. Wheeler, the first president of Northland College. Eventually, in 1947, Lena and her 6 grown children purchased the home from the Wheelers. Lena died just 2 years later, but she is largely credited with the strong family connection that has endured and exists to this day. The Ungrotts have returned to this spot for the past 77 years, 6 generations, and thousands of memories. We know our cousins, second cousins, and second cousins 3 times removed. Speaking of memories, in a wonderful small world moment, Petra Holter, hi Petra, of the Washburn Heritage Association shared with me that as a girl, she was friends with the Wheelers' granddaughter and visited the cottage several times before we owned it to swim and jump off the point. When she described what she remembered about the cottage, I chuckled because it remains largely unchanged to this day. And we still jump from the point. This is not the only evidence of our impressive bravery and questionable judgment. Ben Ungrott's bold and pioneering spirit has manifested itself in a number of wild inventions at the cottage. One summer in the late 70s, we arrived to find that Uncle Brud and Cousin Mark had strung a cable over the water between 2 points, attaching the handlebars of a bicycle to a metal wheel in what may have been the first zip line. My sister Patrice, shown here, was one of the first to try it out, fortunately after they had discovered that they should attach a rubber stopper midway between the 2 points. It should be noted that it took them 1 run to figure that out. In another feat of ingenuity, the greatest generation took to the brownstone embankment with pickaxes, carving a man-made culvert to the lake. Interestingly, no dynamite was used, because everyone knows that is for fruit trees. Using railroad ties, a homemade dolly and motor and winch at the top of the slope, they fashioned a lift with which generations of boats were pulled from the water. And I know what you're thinking. How many dogs or children were killed through the years by a runaway boat? Fortunately, we were all well trained to stay away from the rails, so no one was lost. That said, one summer, Brud sent my cousin Brennan down into the water to oversee the lowering of the boat. You're already laughing. While standing in the water, Brennan felt a distinct tingling in his legs that felt suspiciously like mild electrocution. He shouted up to Brud that there may be an ungrounded electrical current. It sounded something like this: "Hey Brud, I think I'm getting electrocuted." Now, if you knew Brud, then you will not be surprised by his response, which was, "You are not." Brad then marched down to the beach and out into the water, and after a moment's pause was heard to say, "Well, what the?" By the way, it's so much funnier when my cousin tells it. But Brad was our family engineer and mad scientist. He loved the cottage deeply, and we miss him too. The cottage became known as Bay Breeze, and at 114 years old, she stoops and sags here and there, her old windows rattling and screen doors creaking. The ground slopes beneath her a little more every year, with 2 dorm-style bedrooms upstairs that house adults, kids, dogs, and a jumble of suitcases and wet towels. What it lacks in luxury, it more than makes up to pick wildflowers, swimming in Bodine's brownstone quarry next door, running up the road at the sound of a train whistle to catch candy thrown by the conductor as it crossed our road, and endless summer afternoons swimming, swinging on the giant porch swing, and reading comic books. We remember dinners at the Lido before it became the Spinnaker and before it became the Good Time. We remember the old steak pit on Bayfield Street with the black leather booths. We remember fish fries at Sandy's and burgers from Oddballs, which then became eventually then Patsy's. We no longer own the house on Washington or the hardware store, but each year, some powerful homing instinct calls us back from Michigan, California, Colorado, Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico. No matter where we live, the lake, Washburn, and the cottage is an anchor for us all. We have not inherited it. We are stewards of this special gift, caring for it while it's in our hands before passing it to the next generation. We've kept family journals since 1948, and the entries are proof that we come back to spend our days the same way we have for decades. We used to love boating. We still do. We used to pick berries. We still do. We used to do the dishes by hand. We still do. We used to play games late into the night. We still do. We sing and dance. We tie-dye. We fish. We capture the best point jumps. We mark the beginning of life, the end of life, and the celebration of birthdays and love. We get up for sunrises and the morning shine on the water, and we watch the colors of sunset. We wait for the moon and the stars and the northern lights. And we still love happy hour. While most of us are visitors, there's a branch of our family living the Washburn story. My cousin Jed, who's here tonight, also a 4th generation of Ben and Lena, lives here with his wife Heidi and their 3 kids, Raina, Joel, and Reed. Jed is a forester and for years worked in the building that sits on the very site of Ben Ungrott's first store. Jed is not responsible for any wild inventions at the cottage. More importantly, like his dad Joel, he's a quiet voice of reason and level-headedness. Heidi works for University of Wisconsin Extension, and the kids play soccer and sail and love music. In fact, Raina, who will be a freshman this year, has a beautiful voice. She performs regularly in school and theater productions, and last fall made it to the big top main stage for Old Last Night. It's fair to say that her Grandpa Joel and German folk singing ancestors would be so proud. We watch the circle of life at Bay Breeze. Every few years we lose someone we love, and every few years we welcome someone very special. This is Maya Sola Roscoe, the youngest member of the family. She is the daughter of Hannah and Adolfo, granddaughter of Sue and Jim, great-granddaughter of Skip, great-great-granddaughter of the boy Mayor Paul, and great-great-great-granddaughter of Ben and Lena, who arrived here 138 years ago. Maya will arrive from Grand Rapids, Michigan on Saturday for her first visit, sporting her Bay Breeze onesie. My own family comes up from Madison, and for us, we always experience the return in the same way. Somewhere along Highway 2, we catch the first glimpse of the lake. The car gets quiet as we take it in, and we crack the car window because the dog can smell the lake. As we drive through Washburn, we notice what's new, and finally, as we turn off Highway 13 down the road I've driven every year of my life, we cross over some invisible line that transcends us. Time slows down, our minds stop racing. We look deep into the woods, watching for deer like Grandpa Hub taught us. I asked my 21-year-old daughters for the 21st time whether I ever told them about the railroad tracks that ran across the drive, the walks up the road to pick flowers, about Hugo, the hardware store, parades, and bridge mix. They listen patiently because somehow I think they know that someday they'll tell their children all the same stories, weaving them together with their own as we have for 138 years. Thank you for letting us share our memories tonight. And thank you, Washburn, for all you have meant. I know there are other stories out there besides Mary's the dog. So if you have some individual time, just raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone. Questions or stories that you'd like to share? Anybody? No?
Well, we live just kitty corner from Hugo, and anyway, he always would come over and see the dog and bring him a busk. Anyway, and then it got to be, well, can I take Jessie along with the sheriff? Oh yeah, you know, you just sit there on the chain or in the house, you know. So then he did, and then pretty soon, like I said, the truck would start up in the morning, the dog would start barking, and he had to take her and see him. And, you know, but I still always remember he'd say, well, Chuck is in the truck. You know, and Chick Sheridan. Anyway, and then we'd hear about Jesse's day and his. And he'd come.
Thank
Love
you.
him, though. He was a wonderful man.
Thank you. That's a fantastic story. So good story.
Good story. Anyone else? Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm Julia. I'm sure you'll hang around for a little bit afterwards and probably toward the back. And I appreciate you all being here. It's been a great night.
Ginny, if I could just really quickly, will the Ungrots stand up so that...
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank